Hello and welcome to the 19th in my series of CPD Coffee Time sessions with me, Dr Tina Rae. This is number 19, Developing Wellbeing Through Drama and Art Activities. Many of you will know of my history and current profile in terms of working as a consultant psychologist for Compass Fostering, but also as a writer, and I've written prolifically in the area of mental health and wellbeing for children and young people. Many of my publications can be found with the charity of my choice, which is Nurture UK. So hopefully you'll be aware of some of these publications. And also, of course, I write extensively for the wonderful Sarah Miles at Hinton House Publishers, and we're continuing to publish right the way through the summer here in 2020 during this terrible pandemic, hoping to produce as many resources as we can that are completely evidence-based and user-friendly for practitioners to make use of in schools. And some of them will be incorporating some of these creative activities from this particular session. So what I want to cover today, and I suppose these are the main aims of the session, is to actually define what we mean by art therapy and drama therapy, and think why these particular therapeutic approaches or interventions are so useful, particularly now at this current time whilst we're in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic. And also, of course, going forwards into September when many of our children will be returning to school. I'm going to consider what happens in a session for art therapy and drama therapy, and also highlight for you, hopefully today, some of the key tools and strategies, practical applications, things that you can take away and use tomorrow quite safely and ethically with children and young people that you're nurturing or teaching. And I think this is really, really important. In no sense from this session are you going to be delivering any therapeutic interventions such as art or drama therapy, but you will hopefully be able to use some of the key tools and strategies, and these have been recommended by drama and art therapists as being safe for the non-specialist to use, so you can feel quite certain that this is all okay and above board. So I think for many of us, there's probably an aspect that we've been involved in terms of creative activities such as art, painting, drawing, singing, whatever it is, playing an instrument. But in terms of art therapy, I think for many people, particularly if you have a kind of involvement, I suppose, in the mindfulness movement, or you are a mindfulness practitioner, you'll be very much aware of the real power of art and drawing in particular. And many of the children and young people I work with currently are making use of mindfulness colouring books, and it's a very, very useful way to promote that sense of flow and help and support them, in essence, to gain that kind of level psychologically that they need to be at in terms of actually regulating themselves effectively. So art therapy began with the artist Adrian Hill, who actually coined this phrase or term art therapy in 1942. And this was subsequent to him experiencing a real healing effect of art during his own illness. And that prompted him to go off and work therapeutically with patients, making use of this approach. And Margaret Naumburg was an American art therapist who also pioneered art therapy in the 1950s, recognizing that individuals, us as humans, children and adults alike, can express our unconscious thoughts and feelings through the medium of art. So just to begin, I want us to think about some specific images and think about the ways in which we interpret those, how they make us feel, what they make us think about, what they prompt in us emotionally. There is an old saying that a picture paints 1,000 words. So just looking at this particular picture painting by Picasso, what is it that your response is initially to that particular image when you look at it? What feelings does it evoke? And what feelings do you think that picture describes? And it might be worthwhile just jotting those down now and pausing for a moment. And if you're doing this in a smaller group or with another colleague or two, then it might be worth just comparing notes on this and just thinking about how different your responses might be, and also perhaps thinking why that might be the case. And of course, this is a very famous painting, Starry Night by Van Gogh. It's his most famous painting, instantly recognisable, and I think it's because of this unique swirly style so passionate and so involved, and so visually, I think, kind of draws you in. It draws me in. And it's been the subject of poetry, fiction, as well as that well-known song, Vincent, Starry, Starry Night by Don McLean. There's no denying the popularity of this particular work of art. But it's also really interesting to note that there's very little known about Vincent's own feelings towards his work, and it's mainly due to the fact that he only mentions it in his letters to Theo, his brother, twice, and these are letters 595 and 607, and then it's only fleetingly in passing that he mentions the painting. And this is quite amazing, really, because in his correspondence with his brother, he would often discuss specific works in really a great amount of detail, but not so in the case of this particular work. And I think it's interesting to think, why would that be the case? And it is difficult to actually say. It was painted while Vincent was in the asylum at Saint-Rémy, and his behaviour was extremely erratic at the time due to the severity of his attacks. So unlike most of his work, Starry Night is painted from memory and not outdoors, which really was his preference, to be in nature and to paint in the open air. And I think this may in part explain why the emotional impact of the work is so much more powerful than many of his other works from the same period. Some people have made some stylistic comparisons to Vincent's other well-known and equally turbulent work, Wheatfield with Crows. And I wonder, does the tumultuous style of these works reflect his tortured mind? Perhaps, perhaps not. But I think from my perspective, I would think it does. Or is there something more that we could read within the wells of Vincent's raging night sky? I think this is what makes Starry Night not only his most famous work, but also probably one of the most frequently interpreted in terms of its meaning and its importance. And some people have speculated about the 11 stars in the painting in particular, because if you look here, there clearly are 11 stars. And while it's true that Vincent didn't have the same religious fervour in 1889 when he painted the work as he did in earlier years, there's a possibility that the story of Joseph in the Old Testament might have had an influence on the composition of this particular work. So if I just quote you from Genesis 37:9, it says, "Look, I have had another dream," he said. "I thought I saw the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing to me." And as I said earlier, the Wheatfield with Crows is of the same period in terms of his painting life. And I think it stands out as one of Vincent's most powerful, really most fiercely debated paintings as well, because there are so many interpretations, and they're probably more varied than any other in Van Gogh's oeuvre. Some people see it as Van Gogh's suicide note put to canvas, whilst others delve beyond a superficial overview of the subject matter and favour a more positive approach. And some more extreme critics cast their vision even further beyond the canvas and the brushstrokes in order to translate the images into an entirely new language of the subliminal. And I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Artistic analysis, how we interpret, how we analyse, by its very nature, is a subjective endeavour. Still, I would suggest that the most reasonable interpretations are best undertaken from a foundation based on facts. So looking for the story behind the image is key, it's central in art therapy, and the image is explored with the client, the child, the young person, or the adult, to help consider the content and the meaning for that individual person. And the role of the therapist there in this context is to help that individual understand themselves better, hopefully prompting them and supporting them in the change process, so facilitating that change process. What it invokes in me, the particular image, as a viewer, and in the client or the child might be completely different. So as I said earlier, when we're looking at the works from Van Gogh, there are so many different interpretations, and we will respond differently according to our own experience and our own context. And I think it's interesting, images are not used for interpretation out of context of the session. This is something that we would do within the session if we were taking on the role of the art therapist. And overall, I think what this suggests to us, this notion of different interpretations, is that it really is important for us to explore what an image represents to the client, the young person, the adult, and not draw our own conclusions based on our own experiences. So in this particular image here, you've got the table laid out for a lovely meal, the dinner table. So is that memories of a happy family meal or a sad family meal? Or was that table the place to hide during domestic violence? So art therapy is not a painting lesson. It's not an art lesson. Art therapy images and works that are made within the art therapy session are not made to be displayed. They're not criticised in any sense of their artistic merit or accuracy. It's ultimately simply about having a go. And they're made by that client or the child for themselves, and made by the client for the client. So making that image, the process of making it, helps the thought processes and provides an artifact for reflection. And we know that, for example, drawings do provide significant indicators of a child's development. And really, when they start drawing individual people, they start off those figures as whirls, just whirling around the page, and the arms and legs tend to stick out from the head in the early stages. Then subsequently they will begin to add in a body, and then they will add in more details such as necks, fingers, ears, all the details that we would expect if something was being representationally drawn. And underpinning this, of course, is psychodynamic theory and this notion of transference, which really is, I suppose we can think about it as being about the feelings the client brings into the room and communicates on an emotional level to the therapist who is taking the session. So, for example, a child who is really overwhelmed, hypervigilant, not regulated, will try to make the therapist feel really overwhelmed as well, mirroring, transferring their feelings to the therapist by pushing the boundaries, creating as much mess as possible, creating a sense of spilling over and feeling uncontained, and transferring that to the therapist. And I suppose the best way that I can probably describe transference is it's that moment when you've walked into a room where two people are standing together and you can sense purely from the tension in the room that they've been arguing, and it's still not resolved. It's still unresolved. So I suppose underpinning this too is that we know and need to understand the fact that behaviour as a form of communication, this is what behaviour is. It's a means of communication. And if we considered this kind of behaviour of testing the boundaries in other settings, our first response might be that the child is being naughty or defiant or irritating or just trying to make your day harder. And whilst one of those might hold an element of truth, it's also worth considering what this behaviour is communicating. So knowing the background, the experiences of our children can obviously be key in helping us to unravel this, unpick this, and understand where this behaviour is coming from and what the child is attempting to communicate. It's an absolute essential in a trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive school context. You may well have seen this monkey see, monkey do. I think this is quite sweet, but as an explanation for this emotive form of communication and empathy in humans could be the discovery in neurobiology of what we call mirror neurons, and this is from Margaret Wilkinson's book. She talks about this in some depth. So in experiments with monkeys, scientists discovered that when a monkey ate a banana, the parts of the brain that lit up, i.e. the fired connections during this task, also lit it up in the monkey who was actually observing the other eat the banana. So monkey see, monkey do, that's where that comes from. And of course, as with us, as with humans, this may also relate to the way our brains develop and we learn through imitation. So if we triangulate this in terms of what goes on in the session, there is this notion that the client produces the artwork within the safe, nurturing context of the therapy room with the therapist. So it's a therapist-client image. It's a three-way process, and the interactions go back and forth. And the image that the child or young person or adult will produce could be an illustration of thoughts, feelings, and experience. And these can be both conscious and unconscious. The image really provides an artifact to then be subsequently reflected upon and a record of the feelings at that current point in time. And also when we're talking about this triangle, the three-way communication, the image is really a form, or can be a form of communication between the client and the therapist. And sometimes this can even be what we would call an expression of that therapeutic relationship. And the powerful thing about this whole process is that the image can provide an expression to feelings that words have not yet found, which is why this is so powerful with children who do find it difficult to express their feelings in words and haven't developed that emotional vocabulary, or there have been other traumas in their early years which have impacted severely on the development of language skills, communication skills, and empathy. So the therapist can support the child, the client, the young person in putting words to the feelings that the image conveys to them. And most art therapy sessions for children tend to last about 50 minutes. They can be shorter and they can be built upon depending on the individual child or young person. Obviously, there's a level of differentiation that has to occur. Sessions tend to be weekly, same place, time, same therapist, same equipment. So there's that security, which obviously many of our insecurely attached children definitely need, and certainly our traumatized children. It's a quiet space that this will be conducted in. They won't be disturbed, and there's going to be has to be a consistent response in terms of relationships. The artwork is kept safe, it's in a locked place, and it's kept with the therapist until the end of the therapeutic relationship or period of therapy. And an assessment initially can take around 5 weeks. And in the context of the majority of my SEMH schools, social, emotional, mental health needs schools, therapists reported that they generally take up to 3 years in terms of the treatment for an individual child or young person. So thinking about what the art therapy room looks like, there was a sink, there are art materials, clay paint, pencils, pastels, glitter, junk box, so sort of think a bit Blue Peter-ish, different types of paper, rolling pins, clay cutters, and a lockable cupboard obviously to store the artwork, and useful extras could be the whiteboard, a sandpit and toys, and a potter's wheel if you're very lucky. And I think it's really important to highlight that the sessions are non-directive. This is not teaching. This is entirely child-led. There is no right or wrong way with the art making. It's about having a go and using the materials for play and to express. So an art psychotherapist's role is not to teach art making techniques, but to support the young person to realise their idea, be able to express it in art. And what art therapists will factor into their thinking and approach here is their knowledge of child psychology and the fact that some children may need to revisit younger stages of development to help fill in the gaps of experiences that they've missed in their early years. And we know this is the case for many of our insecurely attached children, young people, and those in care. Using play and imagination supports emotional psychological development, and also creating visual representations of our thoughts and feelings helps to facilitate reflection and enables us to process our experiences in a safe way. There is also this notion of working alongside, and this is a powerful element of the whole relationship. So working creatively alongside the child to consider their world. And again, this is really important when children have difficulties in terms of actually making use of an emotional vocabulary. It's not yet been something they've been able to develop efficiently. And there's this therapeutic aspect of actually being creative alongside another. So it mimics the early years of play within the mother's gaze that you would normally have had. And many of the children that, of course, are on the continuum at the higher end of vulnerabilities will have not possibly had that kind of safe space to be with the mother or the early caregiver in terms of actually being able to play safely, being nurtured along that whole process. And I think it was Winnicott who observed the importance of this with small children, in particular playing alone but in the presence of another. And I think it's really important. It's real a sort of prompt to us to be thinking about the behaviour. So when we've got the aggression, when we've got the anger, when we've got the shame, when we've got the real sense of isolation being presented to us, we have to think, what is it that the child is communicating to us through their behaviour? Also, this notion of being the self-reflective practitioner is obviously vital in any therapeutic relationship or intervention. What's our gut response to their behaviour and how do we feel about it? Do others respond to them in this way too? And what purpose does their behaviour serve? Is it that they want to push people away, stop other people getting close, show that they feel overwhelmed, scared, distressed, so that they feel bad about themselves? And I think, in essence, this for me is the real kind of underpinning of having a therapeutic relationship with a child, is that we need to understand where the behaviour comes from. So there are a couple of activities coming up now. You may wish to just pause the presentation so that you can have a go. If you are working in a group with other colleagues, obviously this would be a great time to do just that. And this is called the Squiggle Game. I think many of you will probably know of this if you have any or you've had any experience of working therapeutically with children and young people, but it's a lovely thing to be able to do. You don't need to be, as I said earlier, a therapist to engage in this particular activity. It's fun and it aids communication. So you're working in pairs, you need to work with someone else. Collect together 6 small sheets of paper, 2 different coloured pens, and the first person draws a squiggle. It can be anything, just a squiggle. The second person has a look at that squiggle. What can you see? Is there something that you can see in the squiggle that your partner's put on that piece of paper? So the second person adds something to the squiggle to turn it into something else. They can make it look like a face, a flower, an animal, whatever it is. There's no right and wrong here. Nothing has to be perfect. It's not about producing artwork here. It's about illustrating an idea or simply just creating an image. And of course, you can then engage in what we call the squiggle game, which is basically that you take it in turns to start each of the 6 squiggle pictures and complete them between the 2 of you. Once you've got 6 images, you lay them out together and form a story with them. You can use the images in any order that you like. And this is the fun element. And if you are doing this with other colleagues, this is a lovely activity to do where you can actually sit down and talk about it and tell us your stories. Each pair can tell the rest of the group their stories. And this is a lovely thing, again, to do with children and young people, fostering their ability to communicate, to take turns, to work together in an effective, collegiate way. So in terms of the psychology underpinning this, of course, the Squiggle Game was developed by Winnicott in 1958. And it's an illustration of one of the ways he used to play within his consulting work with children. So it's an easy way with minimal materials to start communication with someone. And it's a playful communication that shows the child that you can use your imagination too, that makes them feel safe in that sense. And it's the turn taking, which is really good for building those relationships. When I was in my first year as an educational child psychologist working in a London authority, I went into a school for children who had been labelled as social emotional behavioural difficulties, and I was asked to conduct a psychological assessment of one young boy, which basically meant using cognitive assessment battery of tools. And I really was not my kind of thing that I was particularly interested in putting those labels on. I was also very, very aware that many of the children were not actually working to their optimal potential in those sessions or in that kind of context of being assessed, because they found it really problematic, so they'd clam up and wouldn't actually so-called perform. I say that in quotation marks. And what was interesting was that one little boy wouldn't talk at all. And because I do a lot of art, and I have always been passionate about communicating through visual imagery and music as well, I decided just to draw. And I drew myself, I drew cartoons, I did little pictures, I talked as I did it, and I explained who I was, but I did the whole thing in cartoons. And then I asked him if he could communicate back with me. If he didn't want to talk, that was fine, and he did. And I think we spent about half an hour with us both drawing these little cartoons. So I would just say the power of this can be quite phenomenal for some of our more vulnerable children. So I also think that you don't need to be a psychologist to do that. You just need to have a bit of common sense and compassion. So I'm just going to also then think about some group activities which emanate from art therapy, which may also be useful to you as a non-therapist, as a non-specialist. And this one is called Creating an Island, and usually takes about 45 to 50 minutes. So you use a large sheet of paper and 3 people are asked to draw out and create an island, and on that island they can have whatever they like, but all members of them have to agree before something is added to that drawing, to that design. And at the end, the groups share their islands and talk about why they opted to choose those particular things. And again, this is really, really powerful in terms of supporting children to develop their pro-social skills, their emotional awareness, their empathy. The fact that it's a joint creation, in essence, shows them that they can actually work creatively, imaginatively together. And also they can reflect upon and think about what's important to each of them. And it may be different. We're not all the same, and we need to learn how to respect each other's differences, learning how to negotiate and work together, building those secure and respectful relationships. And then, think about at the end of this process, is this island a pleasant retreat or a desolate place to feel stranded? What is it about? And why wouldn't we make it a pleasant retreat for each other? And another activity for you to now consider. And this is about, again, reinforcing self-esteem. So everyone's going to get a trophy. You decide what the trophy is going to be for, what you're most proud of. It can be absolutely anything. It could be that you've survived something very difficult, very complex. You've developed a new talent or skill. Many of us have been able to do that in lockdown. I can certainly use Zoom now, which is a miracle as far as I'm concerned. Maybe something that you did that was really special, something that you did that was lovely for another person. And then you draw an image to show us what your award is for. And again, an art therapy technique, I should say, a strategy taken from this approach, which an art therapist has suggested is quite entirely safe for use by non-therapists with groups of children in school contexts and smaller groups. Obviously, of course, like anything, any kind of self-esteem promoting strategy or tool or activity, you've got to be careful that some children will find this much harder to just identify something that they're proud of if their self-esteem is low or has been damaged over time. Ultimately, we're talking about celebrating achievement. It can be the tiniest thing. So I think it's really, really important that we don't have to have something that's enormous, something that's so big. It can be a very, very small thing that we may have achieved or that we're proud of. And you could have an awards ceremony at the end with children actually presenting their awards. And of course, again, the power of art, the power of using visuals, the power of creating things artistically as a joint endeavour. So in this activity, basically, you can be brainstorming or thought storming with children on key issues that affect them. This could be bullying, friendships, how to develop the school for well-being, things that they would like to make the school a safer place, a more nurturing place, etc. And supporting them to think about problems and solutions, and then using their thoughts and their solutions and their ideas to create guides for the whole school. And this is something about really honouring, in my view, the voice of the child here, and it's absolutely essential and vital. And this is such a powerful way of doing it. So, alongside art therapy and art therapy approaches, I think the other most powerful set of tools emanate from dramatherapy, and I think particularly for children who have experience of trauma, who have speech and language difficulties, who have a range of special educational needs. Dramatherapy, art therapy, both are hugely powerful tools for them to begin to explore in a safe and nurturing context. So I'm going to think next in the next few slides about dramatherapy, where that comes from as an intervention, and why it's really so useful with children and young people across the continuum of need. So like art, I think drama is creative arts. Dramatherapy is a creative arts psychotherapy, and what's so powerful is it uses those healing aspects of theatre and drama processes to facilitate psychological well-being. So operates at various levels: physical, emotional, imaginative and social. And just to flag up, this is developed initially around 1930s, during the 1930s, Jacob Marino and psychodrama emanating from New York, and then Peter Slade used drama in educational settings and prisons in the UK also in the 1930s. This developed right the way through to the 1970s with Sue Jennings, the famous Sue Jennings, who has written extensively for Hinton House publishers as well. So do make reference to her publications with Hinton House if you want to follow through with drama therapy. Wonderful work and very, very straightforward, logical and practical advice and strategies to use. So it was not till the 70s actually that the British Association of Drama Therapists was established, and in the 1980s it was recognised as a legitimate creative arts psychotherapy in the NHS. And underpinning all this, of course, is this four-letter word, this notion, wonderful notion of play. What does it do? It promotes healthy brain development, working alongside, being nurtured, playing together. It's the means by which we communicate our inner feelings, our inner emotions, our inner thoughts, and a manner in which children encounter and also assimilate, make sense of their world. And they also learn about the importance of social contracts, boundaries, rules within this context of play. It builds their resilience and improves their confidence to transfer skills learnt in play into the real life non-imaginative context. So just important to flag that up at the outset here. So when we're thinking about play, most drama therapy sessions would start off with a warm-up activity, a warm-up game, such as TIG. So simple physical games such as stuck in the mud or off the ground TIG. They're not only good for warming up in terms of exercising, but they encourage this sense of play and help to build that sense of a group working together, group cohesion. But also it's a non-threatening way to actually enter into a session. And of course, metaphor has to underpin this whole process. So that taps into what we call the right brain thinking. It explores the notion of something as if. It's very, very powerful. So metaphor, it provides distance and therefore it provides safety because it works indirectly for the child or young person or adult. And it also acts as a container. So there's something about the safety of metaphor here. And drama therapists also will encourage the use of what we would call rituals to help contain the work. So opening and closing sessions with a ritual, for example, particularly relevant in working with young people with emotional, behavioural, social, emotional, mental health difficulties who might otherwise struggle with this idea of boundaries. So rituals can also be incredibly powerful in that they can take everyday patterns of behaviour and give them symbolic significance. So in doing this, they intensify the psyche's connection to the material being enacted, creating a real sense of what we would call the sacred, the ceremonious. It was Archild, Grotowski and Brooke. They all recognised the power of ritual in affecting their performers and audiences. You'll get some of these references. You'll get the references at the end of the last slide, but one of this session. Drama therapy too makes use of physical and non-verbal states of expression to create rituals that heighten the experience for participants, whether they be actively involved or they're in the role of a witness. And myths and stories clearly also central to drama therapy. We know telling and listening to stories are as old as time itself. And what do those stories do for us? They provide a real meaning, a sense of meaning and a context to our lives. And they also act again as this safe container, presenting these universal archetypal themes and characters that we all identify with. If you think back to fairy tales, Grimm's fairy tales and the myths and the legends, etc., from say the Scottish Highlands to the Aboriginal peoples in Australia, etc., the characters, events and scenarios and stories become charged with what Gersey called metaphoric meaning. So again, these traditional circle time type processes, of course, part and parcel of the drama therapist's repertoire. And one of the things that I know can be used effectively, of course, by the non-specialists and in a safe and ethical way is that of the story game. So this is when you have the children in a circle. Of course, you have your circle rules. You're very clear about what you can and can't do and confidentiality, etc. All of that obviously has to be made clear at the outset. But in this story game, you're going to in this instance, take one word at a time or one sentence at a time. So the group leader would start, so once, then the person on their left would say upon, then the next person would say a, upon, a time, etc., etc., going around with one word or one sentence. So one of the ones that we often used to use with our younger children was I went shopping, and it was a game that also supported the development of working memory. So I went shopping and I bought a bag of beans. I went shopping, the next person says, and I bought a bag of beans and a bar of soap, and so on around the circle. In the story game, of course, what you're trying to do is to create a story together, jointly owned by the whole group in the circle. And of course, dramatic projections, so making masks, puppets, object plays, stories and roles. And again, there's something very powerful here and safe about actually putting on that mask, becoming that person, feeling that way, as opposed to having to actually present as that person yourself. And with very little children, particularly making puppets is extremely effective. So things like sock puppets, which, I mean, I think it looks a bit spooky, this one, but lovely idea, very easy to do. Some old socks, wool buttons, embroidery thread, or wooden spoon puppets. So just getting old wooden spoons, marker pens, wool, coloured cardboard, etc. Card shadow puppets, or using wooden barbecue sticks, craft card, scissors, etc. Very, very simple ideas and very simple methodology here, but I think the power of it is immense. I've worked with lots of little ones where we have made the sock puppet into a little angry Alex figure, and we've talked about what was making him angry and what happened to him and why he got angry, and then we jointly problem solve what should Alex have done, what should he have done differently, what would have helped him, how could he calm himself down, could he do deep breathing, could he use his calm box, etc., etc. What could he have done differently? And I think in a way what that does is it takes the problem away from the child. It's not like we're saying, this is you're the angry Alex and we need to sort you out, young man. What we're actually saying is, let's look at this little puppet, how can we help him? And it's that transference, that actually putting it out there so that the child can feel safe to explore the problem and the solutions. So models of drama therapy, and this is probably the traditional one in the sense many of the therapists that I've worked with would talk about embodiment, projection and role. And this developmental model, in essence, traces the pattern of early developmental play stages of children. So embodiment, projection, and then taking on role. And embodiment is the exploration of the senses, sensory play and body play, as Jennings said. And then that projective play, so us with our puppets, with the angry Alex sock puppet, etc. So through this projective play, the child starts to explore the world outside itself. There's a shift from embodiment to objects and expressing ideas through imagination. And it's through this projective play that the child can explore their hopes, their fears. They can make use of the stories and puppets and new scenarios for hope and change. And again, this comes from the wonderful Jennings' work. And then the role. And this occurs at around the age of 4 or 5 for the majority of our children. Their play becomes more dramatic and they begin to experiment with roles and dramatic scenarios. And again, Sue Jennings says dramatic play is essential for survival, as without it we would not be able to imagine how things might be and we'd be unable to hypothesize. So again, as we're thinking about these little ones coming into school in September, and we're thinking about what they're going to need, I would suggest that alongside the nurture and the trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive classroom context, they're also going to need access to creative elements, including play and taking on role. So a very simple role play exercise that you could undertake, being the non-specialist, just simply asking the children to move around the space. They can think of their favourite animal. How does it move? Is it fast? Is it slow? Where does it live? And the children can begin to take on this animal's characteristics as they move around the room. And it's really lovely when we do it with them, please. We enjoy this. Thinking about what noises the animal makes. And now think what it looks like in silence. And also how it interacts to other animals in the space. So a dramatherapy group session led by a dramatherapist would usually begin with this opening ritual. There'd be some warm-up games, some energizers, And then there would be the main body of the session, what the drama therapist would call the work. Then there'd be time for reflection, feedback, and again, a closing ritual. So very safe, having this concrete structure, always the same. So I think this session has hopefully given you an understanding, a basic understanding, I would suggest, of art therapy and drama therapy approaches and what art and drama therapists actually do. But one of the main reasons why I thought it was important to include it in this series of Coffee Time CPD sessions is because I do feel very, very strongly that many of us now, in this current context of this pandemic, are going to be having to take on a much more therapeutic stance in our interactions with our children and young people, and feel much more secure about working alongside them and supporting them emotionally. And some of these key tools and strategies do not have to be delivered by a therapist per se, and all the ones that I presented today and said, you know, you could go away and use this, I really do think that you can. And I've had the blessing of creative arts therapists in actually making this presentation, in terms of suggesting that these are the things that you could do quite safely and ethically. So it might be at this point in the presentation you want to just stop and think about what you might use as a direct result of listening to this session today. What ideas, tools and strategies might be useful in your work, in your current context, that you would feel comfortable and safe in using, that you think would be appropriate to specific individuals or groups of children and young people that you're currently teaching, nurturing, supporting. So it'd be really helpful, I think, just to take some time to discuss this and feedback, and also perhaps to think about whether this is for you an area that you think you would like some more support in, you'd like to do additional reading, that you would like some additional training, etc. I think it's really well worthwhile, particularly when we are working with so many children now who have experienced heightened levels of trauma and anxiety, not just through this pandemic, but prior to the pandemic, given the social context that many of our children now find themselves in. So do please take some time to think and to discuss this. So this slide just simply presents you with some of the main references that I've made mention or referred to within the slides so far. So the Handbook of Dramatherapy from Routledge, I've just flagged that up, Jennings et al. 94. But also please do look at Sue's work with Hinton House Publications. I think there's some very, very user-friendly practical ideas and resources that she has developed so that those who are not therapists can use them quite ethically and safely within the school context. So thank you once again for listening and hopefully participating, and I really do hope that this has been a useful session, and perhaps you've learned something new, perhaps it's actually just flagged up for you that there is an awful lot that you could probably do more of that would be beneficial in terms of nurturing and supporting the mental health and well-being of our children and young people going forward. So I hope that you'll join me next time, and thank you once again.